So now we're going to quickly go through how we can do a enemy spawning mechanic. I always say we're quickly going to go through something, but it doesn't always go quickly, does it? Well, hopefully we'll figure out that this isn't as bad as it may sound. All right. So first things first, we have to make spawning locations for where we want our enemies to be populated. And I'm going to go ahead and create an empty game object, reset its transforms, and call it something like enemy spawners. This is just going to be an empty game object that's going to hold all of my spawn locations for my enemy. Next, I'm going to create a 3D object sphere and call this enemy spawn location, parentheses 1. And why don't we reset these transforms as well? And I'm going to pull these up a little bit above ground level. I'm going to go ahead and nest it under my enemy spawners. And this little trigger right here is what's going to spawn our enemy for us. All right. So we know we want the sphere collider that comes with this primitive to be a trigger. And for right now, we'll leave the mesh renderer as is. And we're going to have to add a physics rigid body with gravity turned off, so our colliders will, correctly collide with one another. You just got to have that rigid body in there for them to work correctly. All right. So before we really start placing these around, we have this location set up, and we know we need it to collide with something. But what is it going to collide with? Well, we're going to revisit our camera controller right here, and we're going to add one more invisible box to collide with our enemy spawn locations. This is going to be our enemy spawn trigger, basically. So I'm going to make a cube. I'm going to reset it, and I'm going to just start pushing and pulling, just making another wall. Maybe bring it up just a little bit, just so this wall can collide with the sphere. And I'm going to go ahead and try to position it like so. I want to position it right on the other side of this right wall, right out of our camera view. All right. So that looks pretty good. I guess I could get it a little bit closer. And what do I call this new cube I made? Enemy spawn trigger. And I'm just going to nestle it right underneath my camera controller. So there we go. Here's my right screen bounds, and here's my enemy spawn trigger collider. So with that selected, I'm going to go ahead and make that a trigger and turn off its mesh collision. We got to do one more thing. We got to give it its own tag. So we're going to go to tags. We're going to add tag. New one. Let's say enemy spawn trigger. All right. I'm going to select my enemy spawn trigger game object again, and I'm going to set that tag to enemy spawn trigger. Our little spawn spheres are going to look for any object with enemy spawn trigger tagged to it. And that's how we're going to detect our collision. So now is about the time where we make our script. So I'm going to go to create, make a new C# script, call this enemy spawn trigger. Drag and drop it right onto enemy spawn location. And you can see I have my script attached now. So I'm going to double click enemy spawn trigger. And it's going to be a pretty easy script. Maybe like 5 or 6 lines of code total. The first thing we're going to do is create a public game object variable of enemy prefab to instantiate. All right. Go ahead and just get rid of this. Basically get rid of the void updates and starts. We're only going to be dealing with a void on trigger, enter, collider, other, bracketed up. Nothing new so far. So what we're going to say is if other.tag, meaning whatever our enemy trigger sphere collides with, if that tag equals enemy spawn trigger, all one word, no spaces, just like I typed it up there. And let's make some more brackets. Control Z to undo that formatting. I hate that. Then we're going to say instantiate, and we're going to give it 3 arguments. First, we're going to say what we want to instantiate, which is our public game object we declared up there. And then we're going to say where. So we're going to say transform, or rather game object dot transform dot position, meaning the position of the cube or the sphere that our script is attached to. And it needs a rotation. Same thing. Game object dot. Wow, why is it doing that? Game object. It really doesn't want to give me a lowercase game object, does it? So why don't we do this? It's basically the same line of code. We just need to put in dot rotation, like so. And then we're going to destroy our sphere. I guess you could say this to destroy this, or destroy game object. But I just like using game object. Game object referring back to the actual game object our enemy spawn trigger is attached to. And that's all she wrote for our enemy spawn trigger script. Pretty easy. So now when we select my enemy spawn location game object, enemy spawn trigger script is updated. It's asking what enemy prefab to instantiate. That's when we go down to our prefabs and just drag and drop our sentinel right onto what we want to instantiate right there. And it should be good so far. I guess we could go ahead and test, can't we? So with my first enemy spawn, let's see. There's my wall. And why don't we just go ahead and press play. Oh, let me turn off maximize so we can see what's going on in scene view versus what we see on screen. So I'm pressing play. And you'll notice I have my camera controller selected so we can see that enemy spawn trigger wall we just made. So I'm walking. Right now our camera's not following us. So what do we got to do here? Well, no enemies are on the screen. I can't test it because where's my it's following trigger? Let's bring up my camera controller. So this is something we'll do in a second. I made is following a public static variable so we can access is following from any script easily. For right now, why don't we just pretend like I didn't do that? That way we can see our is following set back up there. And camera stop doesn't like that. All right. So is following is now regular public. So we can press is following, the camera snaps back to us. And hopefully when this wall hits our buddy right there, boom, we have a sentinel spawned off screen. But for all we know, that sentinel was sitting there waiting for us the whole time. And then we can start beating him up. So now that we know that our enemy spawn system we have set up works, we need to figure out some way where we can toggle is following on after we defeat all the enemies on screen. And we're going to do that by making a game manager. Finally getting to the game manager. So like always, we're going to create an empty for our game manager. And why don't we place it right above our camera controller and call that game manager. Let's set up our scripts and make a game manager script. Drag and drop it on the game manager up there. So basically in game manager, all the game manager is going to do right now, we'll probably revisit it in a little bit, is it's going to populate or look for all the enemies on screen and populate an array or a list of enemies. So to make that, we say public game object, and then those brackets right there say, hey, this is going to be an array. And why don't we just call it enemy array, like so. All right. So in update, we're going to say enemy array, if I can type right, enemy array equals game object dot find game objects plural with tag of enemy. All right. And then we're going to say if enemy array dot length equals 0, meaning there's no enemies in my array, then we want to set our camera controller. We want to set that is following the true, but I don't really want to make a reference to it. So why don't we go back to our camera controller script, go to public bool, and let's make it a public static bool. So you have a little new, this is new right here, new little reminder. This means that we can access is following from any script by simply calling camera controller dot is following. And no better example of this than already right here on our camera stopper. Instead of that big long line of code that just wouldn't stop, we now can just say camera controller dot is following equals false. A little bit easier, right, than going other object dot get transform dot get that child dot parentheses 0 dot get component bracket. Oh god, it's infuriating me just saying it out loud. But this is definitely easier. All right, so I'm going to save that. I'm going to save my public static bool is following. Now in my game manager, if my enemy array is 0, meaning there's no enemies currently in my level, we're going to say camera controller dot is following equals true. And that's all we need to do for basically turning our is following flag to true to get the camera following our player. All right, so now I think that's all that's left to do. Let me go ahead and just kind of get rid of some of these scripts, tidy up. I think all that's left to do is kind of build our level right now. So to do that, I'm going to kind of go ahead and turn on some of these mesh renderers so I can see my camera controller at work. I'm going to go ahead and turn on the mesh renderers of all the stops in my level. And the stops are different than my enemy spawners because the stops are halfway submerged into the level, while my enemy spawn locations are floating like so. And then what we have to do now is we have to figure out a good game flow or distribution of enemies in my level. All right. So I don't think I'm going to have this first camera stop right here. Or maybe I should. I think what we'll do to start out the level is I'm going to grab my camera controller and my gambit and kind of, I guess I'll leave it positioned right there so we can get a good look at that broken wall. Seems like a good place to start the level. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to go to my prefabs and I'm just going to go ahead and populate my scene with at least one enemy. We're going to have a sentinel waiting for us on the other side of the screen. All right. So after we defeat the sentinel, we should be able to move our camera. The camera should be able to follow us. Enemy is not defined. Did I enter me? Yeah, I did what I usually do, don't I? It wouldn't be a good video without me making a syntax here. There we go. So now if I press play, there we go. So basically our camera's not following us. But when I defeat this enemy, and I want to highlight the game manager, look at my enemy array right here. The size is 0 and it already has that sentinel I'm fighting populated in it. I'm going to destroy him. But now my camera's following me. And look what happens whenever my trigger collides with my spawn location. My array gets populated with a new sentinel. And my camera should stop as soon as my midpoint collider collides with my stop location. So I'm walking, and I want the action to stop here, focus on this building, and let me do some work. Notice that my game manager is now populated with a new sentinel clone, and boom, my array size is 0. Now my camera is following me. So everything's looking like it should. But what happens if we hit a camera stop and there's no enemies? Am I going to get stuck in the stage? Well, our code should just power right through that because there's no enemies in my array. So it's constantly being updated. That is following is set to true because, this is constantly being called. If enemy array equals 0, then that's true. Then its following will equal true. So now that I know I got things working, why don't I populate my level with some enemies now? All right. So I'm going to make 2 enemies right here. Okay. And I'm going to kind of set myself up for failure real quick. So I got this sphere situated right here, and I got another one right there. These are where enemies are going to spawn. So what's going to happen is, hopefully, I'm going to get stuck. I don't know. I might not, but let's just never hurts to beat the crap out of killer robots anyway. Okay. So maybe not. I think what I have to do is, yeah, maybe make one right outside the bounds here. What I'm trying to demonstrate is sometimes an enemy may be spawned too early before we hit our camera stop. So you don't have any enemies to kill because they're all off screen because they've been spawned off screen. But yet we've hit our stop location in the middle of our screen. If that happens, all you got to do is just readjust your enemy placement and make sure that conundrum doesn't take place. But I might as well go ahead and show you what's going on. So our enemy right there is spawned. He's waiting for us. And then we're going to knock him down and get past him. Our next enemy spawned. And here we've hit this area right here. It's not the prettiest looking gameplay ever. But I think it's good for what we're learning right now. I'm not going to stress about it in this lecture. All right, so we defeated those enemies. And there we have another sentinel right there. He's waiting for us off screen. We stop the camera. We fight this guy. And then we're good to go again. So that's the basic game loop that we're starting to create here. So after you get your enemy spawn system set up with your game manager, you can go ahead and populate the rest of your level with enemies based on, the enemy trigger, the midpoint, the camera stops. At this point, it's all design, right? It's not a brain buster or too much of a, design hassle, but it is what it is right now. So what I'm going to do now is just hide all the mesh renders off of all these game objects that are just triggers, basically. I'm going to hit maximize on play, and let's see what happens. See if we get a nice little bit of gameplay. Boom. The camera snaps to us. We have a sentinel waiting for us. We go ahead and take care of business. The sentinel was waiting for us the whole time. And to progress, we have to defeat him. The camera jumps to us, so we can now move to the right. I got these buddies waiting for me, or this guy. Oh, you got a hit on me. And now we're updated, and we can just continue on. So really, the only thing left to do here is to, I guess, maybe add some additional UI elements, maybe. I don't know. Maybe a scoring system or a timer. I don't know if those would be functional to our game, but I think we've done that in the past, so I might just skip over it. You can add that if you want. We definitely need to make a win condition. And then we have to do some testing of our little game. It's not a very big game, but I'm sure there's some bugs that are probably happening here and there. I think the enemies may be a little too floaty, for instance, or uh, maybe sometimes the attacks aren't popping off whenever they're doing the animation. I think I've noticed that when I was testing on my own with multiple enemies on screen. So we're really closing the gap here. We're almost done. All we got to do, like I said, is make a win condition for the level and do some bug testing, and I think we'll be able to call it a project. This has been a pretty big one so far, but we've learned a lot. Player controllers, enemy AI, uh, a collision detection between a player and an enemy. And now we have some really cool UI stuff under our sleeve to make those nice health bars shrink and grow. Mainly just shrink. We don't have any health power ups. And yeah, we're just hitting it up. So next lesson, we'll continue the good fight and talk about maybe adding a win condition to the game.